The last photo of Elsie Blackwood and her father, David, was taken at a dusty gas station near Ely, Nevada. Elsie, just 8 years old, stood beside their silver Ford Bronco, grinning with a melted popsicle in her hand. David, who had been struggling with depression after his divorce, looked tired, but in that moment, he smiled. It was meant to be a healing road trip, a chance for father and daughter to reconnect and breathe away from the court dates and custody fights. They were headed to Crescent City, California, to visit David's sister. It was a 3-day drive, filled with scenic routes, planned campgrounds, and postcards Elsie had promised to send. But they never arrived. That final image, innocent, mundane, would later haunt investigators and family members. No one knew it would be the last proof of life. No one knew that what seemed like an ordinary trip would evolve into one of the most unsettling justice stories in the state. And certainly, no one guessed that it would take 16 years, a rusted-out junkyard, and a forgotten message scratched in metal to bring the story back into light. David and Elsie left Cedar Hills, Utah, on June 14, 1997. The plan was to take US Route 50 through Nevada and then north into California. They were supposed to check in every evening. David's sister, Rebecca, waited anxiously for the call that never came. She assumed a change in plans, maybe a detour to a lake, a missed payphone stop. But by the second night, with no word, she began calling. Police were alerted. Initially, the missing persons report was filed without urgency. David was an adult with legal custody. He had a history of withdrawing when overwhelmed. Still, something felt wrong. When the Bronco didn't appear anywhere along the expected route, and no campsites reported seeing them, the tone shifted. Flyers were posted across rural towns, local news aired their photos, and rangers were notified. But the trail went cold. No tire marks, no personal items, no witnesses. It was as if the car had been swallowed by the desert. As weeks turned into months, whispers of suicide or intentional disappearance surfaced. But those who knew David insisted he would never hurt Elsie. Whatever had happened out there, someone else was involved. 3 years after their disappearance, in 2000, a retired trucker named Glenn Hill was hiking near the Black Rock Desert when he stumbled upon a pair of dusty pink shoes half buried under sagebrush. They looked small, like they belonged to a child. He almost left them, assuming they were from a camper. But something about the size and the way they were placed, side by side, toes facing west, made him uneasy. He brought them to a local ranger station, where a rookie officer remembered the Elsie Blackwood case. The shoes were examined. Size and style matched a pair Elsie was last seen wearing, but no other evidence was nearby. No clothing, no vehicle parts, no blood. The area was searched thoroughly, but again, nothing. Investigators began to wonder, were the shoes planted? If so, by whom and why? The shoes triggered renewed interest in the case, but after months of canvassing, the case returned to silence. To this day, no one has been able to explain how those shoes ended up nearly 100 miles off their projected route, or why someone would leave them that way, neatly, deliberately, as if waiting to be found. By 2004, the Blackwood case was quietly moved into the cold file room. Rebecca, David's sister, continued to send postcards to the old P.O. box, even though no one collected them. Elsie's room in their Utah home remained untouched, her stuffed bear still perched on the pillow. For families of the missing, time becomes a strange currency. Each year that passes without an answer is both a wound and a wall. The more time goes by, the harder it becomes for law enforcement to justify resources, yet the pain never dulls. When the shoes were discovered, Rebecca had hoped it meant a fresh lead, but it led nowhere. The pain was compounded by silence. Some neighbors began to whisper that David had snapped and driven off a cliff. Others blamed trafficking rings or even backwoods cults in Northern California. Everyone had theories. No one had answers. For justice stories like this, the injustice isn't only in what happened. It's in how it slowly gets erased by time. But one thing Rebecca never let go of was her gut feeling. Elsie didn't just disappear. She was waiting somewhere for someone to notice the clues everyone else missed. Then came the call in 2013. A junkyard worker outside Redding, California, was dismantling an old 1980s utility truck when he noticed something strange on the inside panel of the back door, writing scratched into the metal. "She's still here." Underneath, the words were faint, almost invisible, unless you tilted the metal toward the light. Beneath it, wedged behind loose insulation, was a faded children's postcard from 1997. On it was a drawing of a bear, and the words, "Dear Aunt Becky, we saw deer today." It was signed. LCB investigators rushed to the scene. They traced the truck's registration history, discovering it had passed through rural hands and chop shops for years. But the timeline fit. The truck had been registered in Crescent City the same week David and Elsie vanished. For the first time in 16 years, the case was alive again. And this time, the evidence wasn't just physical. It was a message. Someone had tried to say something. Someone wanted to be found. And beneath the layers of rust, time and silence, the story of what happened to Elsie Blackwood was about to be unearthed. The postcard was no bigger than a palm and slightly water-warped, with rounded corners and a cartoon bear on the front. On the back, the writing was uneven but sweet, clearly written by a child. It read, "Dear Aunt Becky, we saw deer today. I counted 4. Daddy says we'll be at your house soon. I can't wait. Love, Elsie B." It was dated June 15, 1997, one day after they left Utah. Investigators and family froze when they saw it. That date was long after they were last seen at the Nevada gas station. Had someone else mailed this on Elsie's behalf? Or was she alive and trying to signal someone? And why was it hidden behind insulation in a junked truck? The message shifted the case. It wasn't just a memory. It was a timestamp. The kind of detailed justice stories often hinge on. It said, she was alive longer than anyone thought. Someone kept her hidden. And more chillingly, it hinted she may have tried to reach out all along. But no one had been looking in the right place. Detectives pulled DMV records and traced the junkyard truck's chain of ownership. It had once been registered to a man named Leonard Stokes, a mechanic who lived just outside Crescent City. Stokes had a history of moving around, often living out of his vehicles, and had run several mobile repair operations between 1995 and 2005. He had died of a heart attack in 2009, which meant investigators couldn't question him directly. But his record showed the truck had been impounded twice, once in 1998 and again in 2003, both times within driving distance of where the shoes had been found. As detectives connected the dots, they uncovered something else. In a 1997 police report filed in Redding, Stokes had been cited for illegal camping, with a young girl, no ID, listed in the notes. That report had never been followed up. The officer who filed it had retired. No photos, no interviews, just a passing reference. The girl was described as quiet, looked about 8, brown hair, possibly Hispanic. The physical description matched Elsie, but no one made the connection, until now. Hoping to confirm the truck's connection, investigators tracked down people who had known Leonard Stokes. One of them was a woman named Brenda Kelly, who ran a diner along the Oregon-California border. When shown a picture of Elsie, now aged to a projected 24-year-old version, Brenda's hand trembled. "I saw her," she whispered. She used to sit right by the window, wouldn't talk much. He said she was his niece. Brenda described a quiet girl who always ordered fries and never smiled. What stood out was that she never had toys. never carried a backpack, and always kept a small journal clutched in her hand. Brenda remembered that one day, the man and girl disappeared abruptly. He left a mess and didn't pay. Her memory helped confirm what had only been speculation. Stokes had been traveling with a girl matching Elsie's description. It was the first time in 16 years someone could say with certainty. Elsie had been alive after her disappearance. But why hadn't she run? Why hadn't she screamed? The answer, investigators feared, would be far worse than anyone expected. How many times had people looked away? The question haunted Detective Lee, who had taken over the cold case after the postcard resurfaced. Elsie hadn't vanished into thin air. She had been hidden in plain sight. Restaurants, gas stations, roadside stops, places where adults saw a quiet girl and assumed she was fine. But no one asked questions. No one wondered why she never made eye contact, or why the man with her avoided giving a last name. In justice stories like these, the tragedy is not only in what was done, but in what was ignored. Lee started compiling a map of every confirmed sighting, every potential route. Patterns emerged. Stokes had stayed in areas just outside police jurisdictions. He chose quiet towns, places with limited surveillance and fewer questions. The kind of places that made it easy for a child to disappear even while being seen. And Elsie, at just 8 years old, likely understood that her silence kept her alive. But now, they were close, closer than ever. And if she had left one message, maybe there were more. The next step was clear. Investigators returned to the junkyard and began dismantling the truck piece by piece. They found small scratches in the metal, numbers, initials, short words that had been carved in places only a child might reach. On the inside of the wheel well, etched deep, was a sentence. "My name is Elsie. I am not dead." It wasn't just a plea. It was a correction. Elsie hadn't wanted to be forgotten. She had been fighting for someone to hear her, even when the world had gone quiet. Rebecca, shown the photos of the carvings, broke down. She hadn't heard her niece's voice in 16 years, yet here it was, in steel, in rust, in silence. The story was no longer just about a missing child. It had become about the voice no one heard, the child no one asked about, and the courage it took to leave messages behind, hoping that someday someone would finally be listening. "My name is Elsie. I am not dead." The words weren't scrawled in crayon or pencil. They were carved into cold metal, deep enough to withstand time, shallow enough that they might have never been found if the junkyard hadn't been scheduled for demolition. It was written in jagged letters on the inside panel of the wheel. Well, a place only a child could fit. The investigator who found it later admitted he felt like he was standing inside a grave someone had screamed from. For Elsie to write that, she had to have been inside that truck long enough to try, long enough to believe no one was coming. The sentence broke hearts, but it also lit a fire. It meant she'd survived long after she was declared gone. It meant her story hadn't ended in 1997. It had just been silenced. And now, the silence was cracking open. What other messages had she left behind, hoping someone, anyone, might find them? Inspired by the carvings, detectives returned to Brenda Kelly, the diner worker who'd seen Elsie years ago. Brenda had mentioned the girl carried a small book, always clutching it to her chest. When asked if she remembered what became of it, Brenda paused. He told her to throw it away one night. She cried, said it had drawings in it, said it was all she had left of her mum. Investigators searched nearby trash sites and even reached out to local archives, hoping someone had salvaged old landfill materials. Nothing turned up. But in the junkyard truck, under the driver's seat, they found a tiny strip of blue canvas. It matched the kind of cloth used for children's journals in the 1990s. Inside was a single paper scrap, torn and faded, with a drawing of a house, a girl, and a man. In big letters above them, "We live in the truck now." There was no signature, but the style matched other writings identified as Elsie's. Each new detail wasn't just heartbreaking, it was proof, evidence. This was no longer a cold case. It was active, urgent, personal. Leonard Stokes had lived under multiple aliases. A deeper dig into his background uncovered several IDs under different names in Oregon, Arizona, and Northern California. One name stood out: Warren Jameson. Under that identity, he had rented storage units and short-term housing, none of which had been investigated at the time of Elsie's disappearance. When authorities visited one of the old units, now vacated and filled with broken furniture, they found a locked metal box hidden behind a false wall panel. Inside were children's hair ties, plastic barrettes, and one Polaroid photo. The image showed a young girl, believed to be Elsie, sitting on the back bumper of the same utility truck. She wasn't smiling. Her knees were bruised. There was a chain-link fence in the background. The photo had no date, no note. But it was real. It proved she was still with him months after the police had stopped searching. And more disturbingly, it suggested he had kept track of her, possessed her, as part of something much darker than they had suspected. Not just abduction, imprisonment. Detective Lee gathered every document from the original 1997 investigation and began identifying all the missed red flags. The camping violation where no ID was checked. The police officer who never followed up on the quiet girl. The diner owner who assumed it wasn't her place to ask. Dozens of near misses, almost close calls. All of them stacked like dominoes that had never fallen. If just one person had asked one more question, Lee said, she might have been saved. This wasn't just a case of abduction. It was a case study in how vulnerable people fall through cracks. Elsie's name had sat on files in storage for 16 years while her body moved through gas stations, forests, parking lots, hiding in plain sight. The lesson was brutal. It showed that sometimes justice stories take so long, not because no one cared, but because no one believed it was their job to care enough. Now, that was changing, because somewhere out there, if she was still alive, Elsie had to know someone finally was listening. The Polaroid was shown to Rebecca Blackwood. She hadn't seen her niece in almost 2 decades, but as soon as she looked into the girl's eyes in the photo, she collapsed into tears. That's her. That's Elsie. The bruises on her legs, the sadness in her posture, the silence, all of it screamed the truth. Rebecca pressed the photo to her chest, whispering, "I knew you were still here." The discovery prompted a renewed press briefing. This time, reporters called it what it was: captivity. The public outrage grew. Tips began to pour in. Truck stops, campsites, even old neighbors of Leonard Stokes. But more importantly, Rebecca wasn't alone anymore. She became a voice for families with forgotten cases, fighting to reopen other lost files. The photo of Elsie was printed and pinned to police station walls across 3 states. It wasn't just a relic. It was a mission. The search wasn't about answers anymore. It was about finding Elsie before time silenced her completely. In 2001, a woman named Naomi Ellis was working night shift at a gas station near Shasta Trinity Forest. One cold October evening, she noticed a man filling up an old truck. In the corner of the lot, crouched near a bin, was a young girl digging through discarded sandwich wrappers. Naomi walked outside, concerned. The man rushed over, grabbed the girl's arm, and barked something. Naomi remembered the girl had dark eyes and didn't speak, just stared, frozen. When Naomi asked if the child needed help, the man smiled too wide and said, "She's tired. She's mine." Naomi believed him. She watched them drive off, but couldn't forget the girl. She never filed a report. Years later, seeing Elsie's aged photo on TV, Naomi froze. That girl, same face, same fear. That single moment, dismissed at the time, was now a thread in the unraveling truth. Elsie had been there, starving, waiting. Only now, the world realized how many silent screams had gone unheard. Detectives began creating a timeline, piecing together every reported sighting, even ones long considered irrelevant. From 1997 to 2004, the truck had been spotted near logging sites, highway rest stops, and scrap yards across Northern California and Southern Oregon. Many were remote locations, far from cell signals or major patrol routes. One logging foreman recalled a man and girl living in an abandoned trailer behind the worksite. The girl never played with the other workers' kids. She just stood at the door, watching. As this pattern emerged, the grim picture became clear. Elsie hadn't just been taken. She'd been transported, hidden, recycled through the outskirts of society like scrap metal. Each place she passed through was another chance to be saved, and another failure. The map told its own justice story, a route of suffering drawn not with ink, but in bruises, silence, and missed chances. But it also gave detectives hope. If they could follow the route backward, maybe they could find where it started and where it ended. In December 2013, a tip led investigators to a now abandoned RV in Siskiyou County that had once belonged to Leonard Stokes under one of his aliases. Locals said he'd parked it there for over a year before disappearing. It had since been vandalized and partially burned. Inside, most of the structure had been stripped, but a carpenter helping police noticed something odd. A portion of the back wall was built over thicker framing. When removed, it revealed a hidden compartment no larger than a dog crate, lined with blankets and a rusted flashlight. On the wooden panel inside, carved in a child's hand, were the words, "I am not allowed out when people are close." Next to it, a tally of vertical lines, at least 100 etched marks, one for each day or each time she was locked in. The reality was crushing. Elsie hadn't been moving freely in the truck. She'd been hidden, like cargo. This wasn't just kidnapping. It was confinement. And the camper wasn't a shelter. It was a cage. As more fragments of Elsie's past were uncovered, media attention surged. Reporters called it a real-life ghost story, a girl seen but never saved. But to Rebecca, Elsie wasn't a ghost. She was a child who had been failed by 100 moments of silence. Each carved message, each witness who stayed quiet, was a reflection of a society that didn't want to get involved. "If you see something, say something," had become a national slogan, but in Elsie's case, it had come years too late. Still, something had changed. People began looking harder. Old co-workers of Stokes came forward, some admitting they'd had a bad feeling, but said nothing. A truck stop owner turned in a napkin with a child's sketch found years ago, possibly Elsie's. The silence that once buried her was breaking. The justice story wasn't just about her rescue anymore. It was about everyone choosing finally to listen. By early 2014, the wall of evidence grew, not in quantity, but in meaning. The investigators created a digital reconstruction of Elsie's journey. Each location now bore a tag: drawing found, sighting confirmed, carving discovered. What emerged wasn't just a travel log, it was a survival map. Elsie had left pieces of herself like breadcrumbs for the world to follow. Her messages weren't screams, they were whispers etched into metal, drawn on napkins, clutched in plastic bags. All saying, "I'm still here. Please find me." The final dot on the map ended just outside a dried-up creek near the California-Oregon border. No one knew what they'd find there, but hope flickered. This was no longer a story about disappearance. It was about endurance. And as one investigator wrote in his report, "She didn't vanish. We just weren't looking hard enough." In March 2014, a search team headed into a dry creek bed near the California-Oregon border, one of the last pinned spots on Elsie's reconstructed trail. The ground was brittle, scattered with rotted wood, rusted cans, and broken glass. Searchers were about to call it for the day when canine handler Joanna Harris noticed her dogs circling a tree stump repeatedly. When they dug beneath the roots, they uncovered a rusted tin lunchbox. Inside were damp scraps of paper, the kind that tear at the edges if you breathe too hard. On the top one, in smeared ink, were the words, "My name is Elsie Blackwood. If you find this, I am real," Joanna whispered. I heard someone say her name before I even read it. It wasn't just eerie, it was sacred. A message buried, literally, in the dirt. A voice fighting to exist. And suddenly, this wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a reckoning. The rusted lunchbox held more than just paper. Inside was a broken crayon, 2 safety pins, and a short strand of faded blue ribbon. Fragments of a child's world. The papers themselves were mostly torn sketches, a drawing of a treehouse, a stick figure girl standing by a truck, a son with no face. One paper had a full sentence written repeatedly. "Today he was nice, but I still stayed quiet." The consistency in handwriting and ink matched the postcard and journal scrap found earlier. These weren't random artifacts. They were time-stamped pain. Investigators estimated the lunchbox had been buried around 2003. Forensic teams tested it for fingerprints. One partial match came back. Elsie's, from her childhood medical records. There was no longer any doubt. She had been alive. She had been leaving a trail. But what no one knew yet was whether the trail ended there or if there was still more to find. 10 feet from the stump, a searcher tripped on a piece of torn tarp buried under rocks. Beneath it was a shallow impression in the dirt. The air turned heavy. For hours, they feared they had found a makeshift grave. But when excavation began, what they found wasn't human remains. It was a dugout crawl space, about the size of a bathtub, lined crudely with plywood and a rotting sleeping bag. A candle stub, a bent spoon, and a tiny pile of chewed pen caps lay inside. This was no grave. It was a hiding place. A place where someone small had spent time, maybe hiding from the man who'd taken her, maybe hiding from the world. The makeshift shelter told a chilling story. She had been here, possibly alone, possibly waiting. The question that kept surfacing wasn't just what happened to her. It was how long had she survived on her own. As spring 2014 arrived, the weight of the case became more than just investigative. It was personal. Journalists stopped calling it a cold case and began calling it what it was, a system failure. For 17 years, the world moved on while a girl lived in the shadows, leaving behind bits of herself, her drawings, her carvings, her fears in ink. And yet, it had taken nearly 2 decades for anyone to put the pieces together. Investigators held community events showing Elsie's photos, asking for any memories, any overlooked encounters. People cried. People apologized. Rebecca spoke at schools about what it meant to disappear without dying. She didn't vanish, she said. She just wasn't important enough to find. That line echoed across news channels and advocacy circles. Elsie's story wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. It was about how silence can be just as deadly as violence. A final paper from the lunchbox was restored enough to read fully. It was a drawing of a stick figure girl on a road, holding a balloon. In the distance, mountains. On the balloon were the words, "To somewhere safe." Beneath the image, in unsteady handwriting, "I will keep trying." It wasn't dated. It had no name. But no one questioned who made it. Investigators printed the drawing and framed it in their command office. It became a symbol, not just of what they were chasing, but of what Elsie herself had been doing all along. Trying, hoping, creating beauty from captivity. And though they still hadn't found her, they knew now that she had never stopped believing she might be found. The sketchbook had no ending. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the story wasn't over yet. When David Blackwood and his daughter Elsie vanished in 1997, Everyone assumed they had disappeared together. But as investigators uncovered more about Elsie's post-disappearance years, one chilling truth emerged. She had likely survived without him. So what had happened to David? A renewed focus on his movements before the trip led to an overlooked file, an insurance form he submitted just days before they left. In it, he added Elsie as his sole beneficiary and wrote in the comment field, "In case I don't come back, she deserves everything." It wasn't a sign of despair. It was protection. A few days later, his bank transactions ceased completely. No more purchases, no gas stops, no cash withdrawals. Somewhere between the Nevada desert and Northern California, David disappeared. And for 17 years, no one had found a single trace of him until someone did. A volunteer named Marcus Pena, combing a dry ridge near Ely, Nevada, came across what he thought was an old metal lunch can wedged beneath a crevice. Inside were torn pages wrapped in plastic. The handwriting was adult, careful, dated June 16th, 1997, 2 days after David and Elsie left Utah. The entries began with, "Elsie is sleeping. I don't know where we are exactly, but I think I'm being followed." Later entries got more desperate. "A man in a white truck keeps circling back. I don't trust him. We'll move again tonight." Then, on the final page, "He offered us help. Something's wrong. If this is found, please keep her safe." The handwriting was verified as David's. The final words, "keep her safe," were underlined twice. Investigators believe David hid the journal before whatever happened next. He had sensed danger. He had tried to protect her. And somewhere in that desert, his trail had ended. Further searching near the journal site revealed a shallow gully filled with collapsed rock. When the rocks were cleared, forensic teams discovered skeletal remains wedged beneath, bones consistent with a middle-aged male, still wearing fragments of a flannel shirt and hiking boots. Nearby were broken glasses and a rusted keychain engraved with the initials DB. The remains were identified as David Blackwood's. His skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, likely a fatal blow to the back of the head. But there were no signs of a weapon, no wallet, no car. It wasn't an accident. He had been killed and left in a place where no one was supposed to find him. Elsie hadn't disappeared with her father. She had been taken from him. This wasn't a family lost on a road trip. This was an ambush. David's death rewrote everything. He had never abandoned his daughter. He had died trying to shield her. The narrative many had assumed, an unstable father fleeing responsibility, was shattered. And that shift mattered, because how we tell justice stories defines how hard we fight for them. For years, Elsie had been just another cold case child, while David was whispered about as the cause. But now, he was seen for what he was, a father who fought, who warned, who planned. His notes proved he saw the danger coming. He didn't vanish. He was silenced, and that silence, ironically, may have bought Elsie time to survive, because whoever took her had no reason to keep looking over their shoulder. They thought no one was coming, but now everyone was. Tucked in David's journal was a sealed envelope labeled, "For Elsie, when you're safe." Inside was a handwritten letter. "You are stronger than you know. If I'm not with you, it's not because I didn't fight. I did. You are my whole world, baby girl. Be brave. If someone finds this, tell her I loved her every second." Rebecca, upon reading it, wept so hard she couldn't breathe. The letter was preserved and read aloud at a vigil held in Cedar Hills. Hundreds attended. Candlelight flickered against a wall of Elsie's drawings and messages. For the first time in 17 years, the community didn't just remember them, they understood them. This wasn't a story of disappearance. It was a father's last stand, and a daughter's long journey through darkness, holding on to the one thing that kept her going: hope. The man who had taken Elsie had been known for years as Leonard Stokes. But when detectives dug deeper into fingerprint records tied to his multiple aliases, they made a discovery that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. His real name was Clifford Wayne Mallory, a drifter and ex-con who had escaped parole supervision in 1994. His history was grim: charges of child endangerment in Texas, illegal weapons possession in Arizona, and suspected involvement in 2 unsolved disappearances in New Mexico. Yet somehow, Clifford had disappeared into the cracks, reinventing himself with forged documents, working odd jobs, and living on the road. For nearly 2 decades, he had been invisible, except to one person, Elsie. While the world forgot his face, she was the one forced to memorize it. Now, his true identity brought everything into focus. The man who had been called a loner mechanic was, in fact, a predator hiding in plain sight. Mallory's criminal trail stretched back to the early 1980s. Police reconstructed his movements and discovered a disturbing pattern. Each time he vanished from one state, a young girl or woman was reported missing nearby. Though he was never charged in any of those cases, the timing and proximity were undeniable. Mallory had learned how to stay on the move. He used vehicles as homes, rarely registered his name to a physical address, and manipulated people into trusting him just long enough to disappear again. His favorite strategy: offering help to travelers. That's what David Blackwood had written in his journal. He offered us help. Now, detectives believed Mallory may have stalked the father and daughter before making his move. His truck had been seen at a diner. They stopped it the day before the gas station photo. He'd likely followed them onto the open road and waited for the moment David let down his guard. It wasn't random. It was targeted. Under the alias Warren Jameson, Mallory had rented a storage unit in Eureka, California, just 40 miles from where Elsie's lunchbox was found. The unit had been abandoned since 2008 and was scheduled for demolition. Police accessed it with a warrant. Inside was a chilling museum of control, children's shoes, a broken camcorder, maps with red circles along rural highways, and one large metal cabinet that had been padlocked shut. When opened, it revealed walls lined with photographs, some of landscapes, some of faces. One face appeared again and again: Elsie, from different angles, in different years. Some photos were marked with dates. Others had words scrawled beside them: obedient, quiet now, almost forgot. It was evidence, not just of kidnapping, but of surveillance, possession, obsession. He hadn't just taken Elsie. He had documented her captivity like a twisted scrapbook. The images weren't only horrifying, they were proof. And within them might lie the clues to where she was now. With every lead bringing them closer, one question consumed the team: where is Elsie now? The last confirmed sign of her was in 2004. 10 years had passed since then. Could she still be alive? If so, was she hiding or being hidden again? Investigators published the images from the storage unit, blurring her face but revealing details of location and setting. Within days, tips came in. Someone had seen a girl like that near Mount Shasta. Another recalled a quiet woman at a trailer park who never gave her real name. But nothing stuck. The possibilities haunted them. Had she escaped and chosen anonymity? Had she changed her name to avoid being pulled back into the pain? Or was she still waiting, too afraid to believe anyone would come? Justice stories don't always end with a rescue. Sometimes they end with a search that never fully closes. And yet, this one wasn't over. In the headquarters of the task force, a wall had been filled with every artifact tied to Elsie. Her drawings, letters, photos, carvings. But now, detectives began adding new names. Other girls who had gone missing along Mallory's travel path. Other cases that had gone cold. For each name, they added a red string to his route. Soon, the board looked like a map of wounds stitched together too late. But it also became something else: a commitment. If they found Elsie, maybe they could find others. If they told her story with clarity and compassion, maybe someone like her would be brave enough to step forward. The board was no longer about just one missing girl. It had become a symbol of how many voices had been stolen, and how justice, even delayed, could still echo loud enough to reach them. In October 2014, a woman named Denise Granger called the dedicated Elsie tip line. Her voice trembled as she described a young woman she'd met a year earlier at a halfway house in Medford, Oregon. She called herself Marie, quiet, skittish, always drawing. But it was the eyes. I saw those eyes on the news last night. Same sadness, same shape. Same girl. Denise had worked with abuse survivors for years and learned to spot the difference between someone who was simply private and someone hiding from their past. She remembered Marie vanishing suddenly after a man showed up asking questions. The home had no cameras, and no records were kept beyond first names. But Denise had kept one thing, an unfinished sketch Marie had left behind. It showed a road, a girl in shadow, and a broken balloon. In the corner, small but visible, were the initials EB. That one slip reignited the entire search. Detectives rushed to Medford. Interviews with staff confirmed Denise's account. Marie had stayed there under unusual circumstances. She had no ID, refused counseling, and insisted she didn't want contact with family. But she was polite, kept to herself, and always asked to sleep in the corner bed closest to the exit. One staff member remembered her hands, covered in healed scars and calluses, like someone who had spent years working rough surfaces. Another recalled her reaction to sirens. She would flinch and disappear into herself. The timeline fit. Marie had arrived just weeks after a storage unit tied to Clifford Mallory was emptied, suggesting she might have been close when it happened. It seemed she'd been living nearby all along, hiding in plain sight once again. Only this time, maybe she had run on her own. One tip led detectives to a church-run shelter deep in the Cascade foothills. The pastor there, Father Raymond Cole, remembered a girl matching Marie's description arriving months earlier. She never gave a full name, but said she was looking for work and rest. Father Cole remembered her carefully. She looked at every exit before she spoke, like she wasn't sure if she could trust the walls. She volunteered in the pantry, slept lightly, and was often seen walking alone in the woods at dawn. Then, one morning, she was gone. No note, just her sketchbook left behind on the porch. Inside were dozens of drawings, trees, trucks, stars, and one page filled entirely with the word quiet. On the last page, a girl standing on a hill, facing away, beneath the words, "If no one finds me, I still exist." That sentence sent chills through the team. She was still trying to be known, just without being seen. Experts were brought in to analyze Elsie's behaviors based on the accounts of Marie. One psychologist said something that stuck. When children are held captive, they learn how to become invisible. They survive by shrinking. Everything lined up. Her silence, her lack of ID, her reluctance to connect. Elsie hadn't just run from Mallory. She had been conditioned to believe that freedom was dangerous, that staying hidden was safer than being helped. The world had failed her so many times. It was no wonder she trusted no one. But the act of drawing, leaving behind sketches, initials, and metaphors, these were signs of someone trying to reclaim identity. She was rebuilding herself, piece by piece. Even if she didn't want to be found, she did want to be remembered. And to the team, that meant one thing. She was still out there, and she hadn't stopped leaving clues. Back in Cedar Hills, Utah, a new memorial wall was built in the town square. It featured the names and faces of people still missing. Elsie's name was there, of course, but something different happened that winter. A local artist painted one of her sketchbook pages onto the wall. The balloon, the road, the phrase, "I will keep trying." It wasn't just a tribute, it was a call to attention. People began posting their own drawings, letters and candles beneath her image. It became a living mural, growing each week. Rebecca visited the wall every Sunday. "I think she'd like this," she said. "It's quiet, but it speaks." The mural didn't replace her. It didn't erase the pain, but it honored the journey. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the mountains or back roads of the Northwest, Elsie would see it, or hear that the world was finally listening. In February 2015, a retired postal worker named Jerry Pike was driving along a remote stretch of road near Cave Junction, Oregon, when he stopped to ask for directions. A run-down cabin sat at the edge of the trees. As he approached, he noticed a figure standing just inside the window. A young woman, still cautious, half hidden behind a curtain. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, but she didn't disappear either. "She just looked at me like she was waiting to see if I was safe," Jerry later told police. He didn't press, just gave a small wave and walked back to his truck. Days later, he saw a news segment about Elsie Blackwood. Her sketch flashed on screen, and he knew. That was her. I swear it was her. Detectives tracked down the property. It wasn't registered. The land belonged to an old logger who had died 10 years prior, and no one had claimed ownership since. When they arrived, the cabin was empty. Dust-covered floorboards, rusted tin dishes, an unmade bed. But the walls told a story. Drawings covered the inner panels, stick figures holding hands, trees under stars, the word "safe" repeated over and over in the corner. Beneath one floorboard, officers found a stack of papers wrapped in plastic, sealed with old duct tape. Inside were torn sketches, small journal fragments, and one letter addressed to no one. "If you're reading this, I left on my own. I was afraid to stay, but I was more afraid to be seen. I am not who I used to be. I'm still learning how to be anyone." Behind the cabin, just beyond the woods, searchers found a single clear footprint. It was fresh, pressed into damp earth within the last 48 hours. Not a hiker's boot, not a man's shoe. A lightweight size 6 women's sneaker. Nearby, the remnants of a small fire pit were still warm. Someone had been there. Someone had left just before they arrived, but they hadn't rushed. No signs of struggle, no panic, almost like she had known they were coming, and made the choice to slip away one more time. The discovery tore at the team. They were so close. The footprint wasn't just evidence. It was her saying, "I'm still out here." And it was Elsie, once again, choosing how to be seen and how not to be. For the first time in the investigation, the team faced an ethical dilemma. What if Elsie didn't want to be found? What if she had reclaimed her life by erasing her name, her past, her trauma? Survivors of long-term captivity often struggle with re-entering the world. Fear, shame, and mistrust become part of survival. Had the search become a rescue or a pursuit? Rebecca sat with this question longer than anyone. She wanted her niece back, but not at the cost of her peace. "If she needs space, we'll wait," she told press. "But we won't stop loving her, even in silence." That perspective reframed the search. They weren't chasing her anymore. They were leaving the light on. Weeks after the cabin search, a park ranger doing rounds near the area noticed something odd. On the front steps of the same cabin, someone had placed a single wildflower, freshly picked, laid gently on the third step. No note, no footprints, no movement, just the flower. Investigators took it as a message, not of surrender, but of presence. Elsie was alive. She knew they had come, and she had left something behind, not because she was asking to be found, but because she wanted someone to know she was okay. It was the gentlest kind of defiance, the quietest kind of strength, and it said more than words ever could. In spring 2015, a social worker named Alyssa Tate visited a women's shelter in Ashland, Oregon to deliver art supplies for trauma survivors. There, she noticed a quiet woman sitting alone near the back wall, sketching. Something about her demeanor, wary but deliberate, stood out. Alyssa offered her a colored pencil. The woman nodded. Her drawing, a hilltop, a balloon, a single word beneath it. Trying. Days later, Alyssa saw Elsie Blackwood's case on the news and felt a strange connection. She wasn't sure until she returned to the shelter and found a folded sketch left on her desk. It said, "Thank you for not asking who I used to be." It was unsigned, but Alyssa knew Elsie had spoken without speaking. Again, as more reports trickled in, a pattern emerged. A woman using different names, always soft-spoken, working at thrift shops or cleaning houses for cash. She avoided attention, but never stole, never lied, just drifted quietly through small towns in northern Oregon. In each place, she left behind the same evidence: sketches, landscapes, symbols of freedom, words like enough, awake, and safe now. One shelter director described her as someone rebuilding herself from scratch without asking the world for permission. Psychologists later said Elsie's path made sense. After years of control, her only way to heal was to own every part of her identity, including her right to stay hidden. She didn't vanish. She survived. And every step away from her past was a form of justice no courtroom could grant. In July 2015, the mural in Cedar Hills grew again, this time with a new sketch left in a sealed envelope taped to the wall. It was simple, a drawing of two hands, one large, one small, holding a balloon together. Below it, a single line: "He kept me safe as long as he could." Rebecca opened the envelope and wept. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Elsie had been watching. From somewhere out there, she had seen the wall, heard the voices, felt the love that had waited 18 years. And in the quiet way that was hers alone, she reached back. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. She wasn't returning to explain herself. She didn't need to. She had finally spoken her truth. This wasn't a rescue story in the traditional sense. There were no final embraces, no triumphant reunions, no court trials or media spectacles. But it was a justice story in the deepest, most human way. Justice wasn't about finding the person who hurt her. It was about giving her space to heal. It wasn't about catching up with lost time. It was about honoring the path she chose. Elsie Blackwood had been taken, hidden, controlled, but she had found a way out, on her terms. And while the world searched for her with lights and microphones, she found something more powerful than rescue. She found herself, and she taught us that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like a wildflower on a step, or a drawing on a wall, or a voice that finally says, "I'm okay." In December 2015, Rebecca received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a card that read simply, "Please stop searching. I have a life now. It's not what was taken from me. It's what I've built. Tell them thank you for remembering me." That was enough. Rebecca didn't take it as a goodbye. She took it as permission to let go of the pain and hold on to the love. Elsie hadn't asked for forgiveness or fame. She had asked for space, and she'd earned it. The final chapter of this story wasn't written by a news anchor, detective, or even a family member. It was written by the girl who lived it. She may never come home, but she's home in the life she chose. And sometimes, that's the only ending we need. If this story moved you, share it. Not just for Elsie, but for every survivor whose story goes unheard. Hidden justice exists to uncover the voices long buried and shine light on truths that don't always make headlines. These justice stories remind us that strength isn't always loud, and that survival takes many forms. Subscribe to Hidden Justice for more real stories that deserve to be told. Stories of resilience, of pain, of healing, and of hope. And if you've ever felt unseen, know this: your voice matters, your story matters, and someone, somewhere, is listening.